Morning, folks. You might have thought that you missed the deals because Cyber Monday is over, but the good news is here at the Chamber, we celebrate Giving Tuesday, not just today, but all year long. And this is one of those opportunities. Our webinar called our Ag Allies Quarterly Webinar. This time, the topic is ag trade and specifically what are the latest developments. Our goal with this program, not just this program, but all of our Ag Allies programs, is to give you insights that help you navigate the trends and the policy decisions that are impacting the future of our state's number one industry, agriculture and agribusiness. The story of American agriculture's contribution to the global trade is an impressive one. If I get any of these wrong, I trust that our panelists or our participants will let me know, or if I leave any out that you think are notable. But depending on the year, generally 3 of 4 rows of cotton are shipped outside the United States. Every other row of soybeans goes the same way, not to mention all the soybeans that go into our protein products before they go the other way. Tobacco, in 2020, around 700 million pounds of unmanufactured leaf exported out into the world. At least 1 in 5 rows of corn, again, not counting what goes into an animal first. Half of our wheat, half of our sorghum, half of our rice, 1 in 5 pigs, 1 in 10 beef cattle, and 1 of every 8 chickens is bound for a mouth outside of the United States. All of that raises questions about where it's going, what those markets are going to look like in a few years, and generally speaking, when it comes to ag trade, are we walking, are we running, or are we backing up? Hard questions like that are exactly why we bring in renowned, smart people to join us for these Ag Allies webinars. Before I introduce the first one of those speakers, let me do a little bit of housekeeping. All of our attendees have been muted today to avoid any distractions during the presentations. However, we do invite you to put questions in the Q&A box, which I will happily then pose to our panelists. If you have a question, don't put it in the chat box, put it in the Q&A. There's also a process there, I think, where you can upvote a question. We'll answer those toughest, hardest, most upvoted questions first. We are recording today's webinar and we'll make that recording available to you within 24 hours via email. And now to our first speaker. Let me invite Christine to turn her camera on while I say really nice things about her, which is not hard to do. She is the executive director at Rabobank, focusing on the animal protein industry with an emphasis in North American pork and poultry. She was a founding partner at Cleveland Research before coming to Rabo. She is frequently cited as a leading authority on animal protein, and I think this is impressive. Get this, quote, best on the street food analyst by the Wall Street Journal and the top food analyst by Forbes. Those are big deals, Christine. So again, we're tickled that you'd spend some time with us this morning. There was one flaw in her resume. I saw that she had a bachelor's degree in ag econ from the University of Georgia. I don't know what to think about that. And then to add to it, she went west, young lady. She went to UC Davis, where she got a master's degree in ag and natural resource economics. Obviously well credentialed. I have seen Christine present a number of times, and when we put this topic together today, I said we basically have to help plan it around Christine's schedule because we've got to have her help. I don't think anyone can take the complex protein trade and boil it down to 10 or 12 slides quite the way Christine does. She lives it, she breathes it, she talks about it, she helps us understand it. Christine, we're looking for all of those things today. So take the floor, and again, thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks, Ray, and thank you all for the invitation to share a little bit about what we're seeing in the protein trade. Today, I'm going to focus on pork and poultry because that is my world. As Ray mentioned, I do cover the space at Rabobank. And on the next slide, you can kind of see really what we've been focusing on in the North American market and the factors that are influencing our outlook. And we all talk a lot about inflation and all of the cost pressures that we're seeing and a lot of the disease challenges that we're seeing globally, not just with the latest coronavirus, but in our animal world, we really have dealt a lot with African swine fever over the last few years. Obviously, some outbreaks of PRRS in the Midwest. More recently, with avian influenza hitting several regions of the world, and all of this comes together to affect trade. Because cost pressures really affect our competitiveness in the global market. If you think about disease and some of the constraints that can create, when you think about the new regulations that are coming into place in California and how that might affect our ability to compete in global markets, all of these really frame up really our competitiveness and our ability to remain viable in the global markets. But what I'm going to focus on here for a few minutes is just how we think about the global market for pork and protein. And if you look at the next slide and just how important trade is to our U.S. pork industry, it's really now making up about 28% of total demand for our pork. Now, a lot of that is lower value cuts that maybe don't have the same marketability here in the US, but the reality is that it's become an increasingly important part of our domestic industry. And at the top of that list has really been Mexico. We've talked a lot about China in the last few years, and it was certainly a huge part of the 1920 outlook for trade, but really as that demand from China has fallen, as they've rebuilt their domestic herd as after their outbreak of African swine fever, it's been Mexico that has come in and really stepped up their purchases of U.S. pork, and that's critical because it's so important for us to maintain that relationship with Mexico, which at times has been a little rocky. I'd say right now, though, it's been a huge benefit to our U.S. industry. And really, it's been a function of a few things. They had some disease outbreaks in Mexico in their pork herd, which left them with a gap in protein supplies. And that U.S. pork has been filling some of that need. And at the same time, our labor challenges that we've been dealing with has left us with a huge supply of bone-in product, which is really, in high demand in Mexico. Now, what makes me a little concerned are two things. One, that Mexico itself is not doing overly great coming out of the coronavirus, especially with their tourism industry still taking a hit. That's a concern of mine. And then two, that economic growth in Mexico really is not maybe where it needs to be to continue to support this kind of demand, especially if you think about their hog herd recovering now. And so they have quite a bit of protein on their market. Prices are falling. So I'm a little concerned about Mexico here in the short term, especially if the latest coronavirus does impact tourism again. But longer term, I'm actually fairly positive, and it's because they can't really meet their internal demand. They do import about half of their protein needs. So some things to think about, especially as China rebuilds its herd. Mexico is in the process of stabilizing its herd and moving higher, but really a very concentrated market. If you look, it's just really the top 5 markets accounting for the majority of exports. If you think about on the next slide very quickly where we are with ASF, that's why it's so important that we maintain our biosecurity. Because so much of our pork is going into the global markets, we need to make sure we remain open to trade. And a big part of that is keeping ASF out. For those of you that aren't familiar, ASF is a disease that really is almost 100% lethal to pigs. And it's been hitting in China. They've recovered some. Europe is dealing with it right now. And most recently, it was found in the Dominican Republic. And that's a big concern because if it gets into Puerto Rico, for example, which is a U.S. territory, our trade will be shut down. And that's a pretty big risk for our U.S. pork markets And just another reason that we need to maintain these markets. But it's equally a risk for Mexico. And that's something that we continue to work with the Mexican government to make sure that they're in front of this issue as well. And then finally, just on our outlook for pork on the next slide, quite positive for this year in general. I think that we aren't growing our supply of pork, in part because of the labor constraints at the ports and at our plants. But generally a fairly good balance. Demand for pork remains very strong here in the US. And as I mentioned, still very good exports next year, just maybe not the same kind of growth that we saw from Mexico in 2021. And then very briefly on poultry on the next slide, poultry has been a big player in the international markets for some time. It does make up about 17% of total demand. But the key difference between chicken exports and pork is really just the breadth of countries that they export to. For years, the industry has been expanding the number of players, and in part because pork faces some religious constraints on demand into some key markets that poultry has been able to get into in Africa, in the Middle East. So there is maybe more opportunity for chicken to expand exports longer term, along with the fact that it tends to be a lower value protein. Now, as I mentioned, the US is fairly well positioned because of our disease-free status at the moment, which is constraining exports from parts of Southeast Asia and Europe. But generally, demand globally has been pretty good, and in part because of the markets that we service generally tend to be very oil driven, which has been a big plus here lately, as well as the fact that, again, China has been taking a lot of our pause. If you think real briefly on the export outlook on the next slide, Mexico, as I mentioned, has been a huge market this year. As you can see, a big increase, again, in part because we have so much bone-in product and they do have an abundance of labor, so able to use very cheap products. But I think if you look at this list, it's a very different list. If you think about Cuba, which is a big top 3 market for chicken for much of this year, Angola, again, being oil driven, but also seeing the benefit of some of these disruptions on the pork side that have been able to create a market for chicken into areas like Vietnam and the Philippines, where they maybe have faced a little pressure in the past. We can talk more specifically about very country-specific issues in the Q&A if you'd like. I just wanted to point out on the next slide, the outbreaks of avian influenza continue to increase. We had a low path case this week in Turkey in the Midwest. This is pretty critical this time of year as we continue to see an increase in avian influenza outbreaks as these flyways open up. U.S. needs to, again, focus on biosecurity to keep disease out of the U.S. and keep these exports flowing into international markets. But in the short term, that actually means better demand for our exports as we keep AI out of the U.S. flock. And then finally, our outlook on the next slide for chicken remains very, very strong. We've had a counter-seasonal move in chicken markets here in the fourth quarter. Maybe people ate more chicken for the holidays. I don't know. Turkey, I think there were some concerns about running out, erroneous concerns. But in general, we've had very strong exports and very good domestic demand. And I think that'll continue into 2022 with really the constraints around overall supply. So I'll wrap it up there. We can talk about kind of the outlook or any specific markets in the Q&A. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Christine. Great quick overview. I feel like I'm going to have to go back and watch it again to absorb everything you said in such a short period of time. Do have some questions, but we'll come back to those. Thank you for your insights. Next up is Dalton Henry, and I'm going to start with the best part. And we were joking about this before we let the participants in. Dalton's actually in South Dakota this morning, and at a farm conference where I'm sure he's on the program. We didn't talk about that, but I assume you're making a presentation of some sort, Dalton. The cool thing about Dalton, though, is he is a proud new papa. His son Samuel was literally born in the last 30 days. I hope he tells us a little bit more about that. And that saved us because there was actually a group of commodity association trade leaders that I think were doing an international jaunt this week. Did I say jaunt? I meant a very important trade mission over into the to our friends across the pond. And because Dalton was a new daddy, we got to get our claws in him for the presentation today. You see on the chart there, or on the screen, the Vice President of Policy for U.S. Wheat Associates. Part of his job is to maintain and improve market access for U.S. wheat outside of the United States. His policy priorities include advocating for new agreements, resolving, and I loved this word, trade irritants, ensuring compliance with past commitments and our trade agreements, developing strategies for the acceptance and adoption of technology in wheat production. Previously, he was the Director of Government Affairs for Kansas Wheat. He's been the Legislative Director for Congressman Roger Marshall, a real friend of agriculture. Grew up in Randolph, Kansas, earned a bachelor's degree in ag communications from K-State. He and his wife, Sarah, maintain close ties with his family's farming operation in north central Kansas. I've been there. There is nothing else to maintain a close relationship with other than farms in that part of Kansas. We are tickled to have Dalton with us again. Congrats on the birth of your son. And we look forward to hearing really a big picture view, what's going on, not just in the wheat trade, but what we've asked Dalton to bring forward is really a conversation about policy and what even the new administration is talking about and where we think things are going on a big picture sense. So Dalton, take it away. Look forward to hearing your comments. Thanks again for being with us.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for the introduction, Ray. And I think being a new parent has certainly been a little bit of a learning curve. I feel as well rested today after 2 days on the road. I think taking out those midnight feedings has been helpful. Although it has given me a lot of time to practice my speaking material. It turns out that newborns don't always just automatically sleep. The doctors say you're supposed to talk to them in a normal voice. They won't understand what you're saying. So just anything that comes to your mind. I tell you, the thing that's really been putting Samuel to sleep lately is as I run through my list of policy priorities, about the time I get down to Turkish flour export subsidies, he's just out and done. So it has at least had a little bit of an advantage for me there. We're going to go quick today because I'd rather spend the time in questions. But really, as Ray said, we're kind of taking a quick look at a policy perspective, especially from a grains front. What have we seen out of the Biden administration? And then maybe taking a couple of slides to look at specific regions where we expect that over the next year to 3 years that we're going to see and hear more focus and discussion on, and kind of take a little bit of a look at that. So we'll go ahead and jump into the next slide. And I tell you, this is not the first administration that I've been using Yogi Berra slides for. It just happens to be that you can almost always find a Yogiism that fits the current political mood. And when I see this one saying we made too many wrong mistakes, that seemed to me to be in a lot of ways what President Biden was saying on the campaign trail. He clearly ran on a different set of rhetoric than President Trump did with regards to trade. But at the same time, we got very few specifics and just this general sense that things weren't right, they weren't being done right, and that he would do it differently. I think that the reality is that we're now into year 5 of a more defensive U.S. trade policy posture. Which is essentially says that this administration has largely continued some of the positioning from the previous one, maybe a little bit more vocal that trade has harmed specific segments of the U.S. populace. Just this week, they announced a study into trade agreements' impact on racial minorities, underserved populations, as well as potential effects split out by gender. That's a little bit more specific look than we've taken at trade policy in the past. And I think it's indicative of the direction that we're headed for at least a little while here. So I think, to the right side of that screen, you're essentially looking at a list of what I've identified as either significant actions or inactions on the Biden administration's part. A lot of that does continue where the previous administration was. I think two big take homes. One is you do not see new market access discussions in a big way, right? We did not renew trade promotion authority. The UK free trade agreement is sitting on ice despite, kind of a cross-country tour by many of their embassy staff to try to gin up some support for that. The Kenya free trade agreement also sitting on ice. And so as we kind of wait to see where those things are going to go, I think those of us that work in trade policy are looking for other opportunities and changing the way that we go about doing our day jobs to find opportunities for U.S. agriculture and market access in particular. And so let's go ahead and jump to that next slide. I think that asks the question of, well, what changes are we going to make? And I think the answer there is that the future just isn't what it used to be, or just ain't what it used to be. The trip that Ray alluded to that we were going to have a set of commodity leaders going to was the WTO ministerial. It would have been the first one we'd had in 4 years. At the last minute, we had staff literally 6 hours from getting on a plane. It got canceled or at least postponed due to the latest COVID variant. But that was going to be a fairly significant discussion on, traditionally that's been the place where we have multilateral discussions on agricultural market access. We haven't had one in 4 years, and the expectations were that we would achieve nothing, if not, and it would be a success if we simply didn't lose the gains we had made in the past. So that was kind of the mark of success for our guys going into that one last week. Is simply let's not erode where we were before. And unfortunately, I think as we look ahead, the gains that we're able to make is, as Ray so well put it, are we walking, running, or backing up? I think we're treading water slightly in a forward direction, probably, in that there are places where we can see access gains. It just won't be the way we used to do it. So we saw an announcement late last week on some markets, very specific market access outcomes with India. Those came out of something that really wasn't even necessarily focused 100% on trade policy, or at least on market access aspects of trade policy. A couple of months ago, we had a similar announcement out of Vietnam, and increasing access or reducing tariffs unilaterally for U.S. wheat, corn, and pork. So those announcements are significant. They're just not the kinds of things that grab headlines. So there is some action out there that is going forward under this administration, just maybe not getting top billing and not really taking maybe a lot of political leadership time as the Biden administration continues to focus on domestic priorities, namely COVID response and infrastructure bills. So taking a look at the next slide, we'll kind of look at 3 specific regions or countries where we do expect that you're going to see substantial news here in the coming months. And I don't think you can do a trade policy presentation today without talking about China. Just that has been a roller coaster ride over the last 6 years. Of course, that now spans U.S. administrations, and we still don't have maybe a clearly delineated position as the Biden administration continues to take what they're describing as a whole of government review of where our policies with regard to China are. Certainly that includes agriculture, but is quite a bit more broad than just agricultural market access. Most notably here, we've mostly stabilized and returned to a period of growth in agricultural exports since the signing of the Phase 1 agreement almost 2 years ago. That'll be 2 years in January. A fair number of folks have been talking about that agreement expiring. Yeah, it's a little bit of a misnomer. What is running out of time is China made 2 years worth of purchase commitments. I think you all are probably familiar with that. It was by far and above the most talked about portion of the Phase 1 agreement. China will not meet those commitments, though they did increase exports. I think that's going to leave the Biden administration with a real question, in that they're going to have to admit that China didn't meet them, but the agreement really doesn't give us a lot of leeway in terms of what can we do about it. And I think a fair number of folks would argue whether or not it was even the most important portion of the agreement. In our minds, the most important portion was the waiver of retaliatory tariffs. So we'll remember with China, the US put tariffs on Chinese products under allegations and investigations of intellectual property theft. China retaliated with tariffs against US agricultural products. For our largest grain and oilseed exports, so we think corn and soybeans. Much of that trade is conducted through state trading entities, which seem to have at least some capacity to navigate those retaliatory tariffs even before the exclusion process. But certainly for the rest of U.S. agriculture, that exclusion process is absolutely critical as long as those tariffs are in place. And I think in large part, you're probably looking, at least from a tariff standpoint, in a status quo type scenario going forward, where both countries seem remarkably willing to just keep those in place and figure out a way to manage around it. But especially with the expiration of those purchase agreement targets, something that's going to be talked about quite a little bit here in the coming months. The next slide is going to be talking a little bit about a region, largely a trade agreement that was designed to kind of counter Chinese influence in the Asia Pacific, and that was TPP. And with the Biden administration coming back into office, because we'll remember this was launched and agreed to under the Obama Biden administration, it then ran into just a lack of political support in the U.S. Congress around the 2016 election. A lot of folks, and especially within agriculture, especially on the protein side, looked at Biden coming back in and saying, look, this is our opportunity to rejoin. It's now called CPTPP. It's an 11-nation trade agreement. To be honest, I just don't see it happening in the near term. It's still politically unpopular. It would be a big lift to get the U.S. in without making substantial changes. And frankly, from a grains standpoint, we have bilateral agreements, either full-fledged free trade agreements or somewhat miniature agreements, or tariffs waived on an MFN basis that really will limit the immediate gains from rejoining CPTPP. From a wheat standpoint, we're done with tariffs within that region in terms of differences that we have with our counterparts in Canada and Australia. So without a substantial push from U.S. agriculture and other groups demanding that this is their absolute #1 priority, it's tough to see this one, at least in my opinion, getting that kind of momentum that other groups are maybe talking about that one needing. Final slide on regions here is going to be taking a quick look at what I think is a potential positive outlook, so that I don't leave you strictly cynical here on a regional basis, and that's Africa. I do think this is a potential opportunity for the Biden administration to talk about trade, not just in a free trade agreement context, but from a developmental standpoint. I think that puts some wind in its sails. Also, the African Growth and Opportunity Act sunsets in 2025 or is up for renewal in 2025. So that kind of says that at some point in the next couple of years, we're going to have to talk about Africa. I think the Biden administration's probably taken a different approach than Trump in terms that they'd like a lower standard agreement, but something continental wide. But the opportunity for growth here in the grain sector is incredible. They're already 100 million metric ton importer in terms of a region, and really not a lot of that coming from the U.S. To date, just in terms of maybe what we would see in terms of logistical advantages that we have compared to the rest of the world. The final slide and thought that I want to leave you with here today is this poll from Gallup. And I kind of live, as Ray mentioned earlier, we export 50% of our wheat on an annual basis. And so market access and free trade agreements and all that is absolutely critical to the profitability of our growers. And tied to that is the view that Americans as a whole hold of free trade or of increased trade. The green line here is Americans that see it as an opportunity. The blue line is those that see it as a threat to the economy. And I think what we saw in 2021 was the single largest drop that we've had in a year to date. And so that's a trend that we're watching closely. I think there's an argument to be made that a lot of this is simply supply chain driven at the moment and that will moderate. But this is key because political leaders are going to be looking at this same poll and their own polls. And if Americans as a whole are turning away from seeing free trade as an opportunity for economic growth, it's going to be really tough to get administration officials or members of Congress to focus on that. And that is such a critical focus for our growers and growers around the rest of the country. So with that, Ray, I'll turn it back to you and look forward to talking more details during questions.
Count on it, Dalton. Appreciate your comments and your big picture view. Do have some things to follow up on there, so I'll look forward to that conversation. Let's go now to maybe a more homegrown crop for North Carolina interest. Obviously would put pork in that category given what Christine had to say, but really looking forward to hearing what Herbert's going to say about the tobacco trade, something that is still very important to North Carolina and to North Carolina's farm economy in particular. In fact, Herbert, I was looking at Alliance One as a company where you are the International Senior Vice President of Global Business Relationship Management. And I got to thinking about it. I would assume that Alliance One is probably the biggest tobacco company in Cary and Morrisville, North Carolina. I suspect I'm right about that. It's a pretty big footprint you have around the world, and the fact that a big part of that foot is right here in North Carolina tells you about the significance of our growers and our infrastructure for tobacco that still exist even in 2021. In his role, Mr. Weatherford oversees the company's global tobacco leaf sales, customer relationships, and logistics, which I think is probably given him some headaches over the last 18 months or so. He's worked with Alliance One and its predecessor companies for over 30 years, numerous capacities, operations, sales, and leaf. Just has a real immense understanding of the tobacco and agricultural industries generally. Prior to being on Alliance One's leadership team, he was the regional director of the company's North and Central American regions. They have operations in Canada, Guatemala, and of course in Eastern North Carolina. Mr. Weatherford proudly serves as a member of the board of directors of several tobacco-related organizations and currently divides his time between the state capitol here in Raleigh and our beautiful coastline, which I got to quiz him on about earlier. I didn't find out if he's not using that house all the time. I mean, I would just volunteer to go down and check things out for you every weekend or so. So Herbert, thank you for being with us. Really an interesting topic here, and again, one that's significant to North Carolina's ag economy. What in the world is going on with tobacco trade, and what do you see coming around the corner?
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for that kind introduction. We'll just move on to the next slide. This is just kind of give you a quick introduction. Ray kind of went through a lot of it when he introduced me, but we are a global tobacco supplier to basically all the major manufacturers around the world. We've got through our legacy companies, we're over 150 years old. We purchase tobacco in over 35 countries, sell into over 90, and we have a large portfolio of customers around the globe. Okay. Next slide, please. So we are based in North Carolina. Our headquarters are here in Morrisville, as Ray pointed out. During the peak of our season, we have close to 1,100 employees, mostly concentrated in Wilson, North Carolina, in 5 different operations. The biggest facility being where we process most of the tobacco we buy from the growers in North Carolina. We do have a cut rag facility that we supply a lot of smaller manufacturers, and we have a stem facility and several other smaller things. But we are certainly North Carolina centric, and we've been here for nearly 150 years. Okay. Next slide. But looking at kind of what's been going on over the last couple of years with regard to tobacco and the consumer and the supplier side, which we're on. If you look at the consumer, we estimate that there's about 1.2 billion adult smokers worldwide, and their production of about 5.1 trillion cigarettes. And in 2021, the decline in cigarette consumption around the globe was estimated to be about 1.2%. Prior to that, it had been declining much quicker in 2020 at 2.1%, in 2019, 4% decline. And that has led to some kind of undersupply situation we'll talk about a little bit in a minute, but most of the major cigarette manufacturers were predicting a larger decline in cigarette consumption through COVID, which didn't materialize as people stayed home and evidently smoked more. One other thing that led to some changes in the cigarette consumption is decline in illicit trade, which is basically cigarettes that move around, particularly in Europe, because of the different tax rates throughout the countries in Europe. So that declined as well, but that consumption went into the major manufacturers. And we're still seeing growth in other combustibles, other tobacco products, which is mainly roll your own and the pipe segment. If we look at the supplier side, our side of things, we have a historically low inventory level held by the manufacturers as well as suppliers. So this is probably the lowest inventory levels we've seen in numerous years. Matter of fact, I can't even remember seeing them this low in the past. Like most other industries here in North Carolina, we are facing labor shortages in our facilities. This is creating a problem and prolonging our processing time, but that is nothing unusual in comparison to everyone else. One of the other big issues that we're seeing are the logistics issues that continue, particularly trying to move product out of South America. That has become very difficult recently. Moving out of Africa, so far we haven't seen as many challenges. However, the bulk of the tobacco that will be moving out of Africa will start at the beginning of the new year. So we'll see how things transpire then. As far as the U.S., obviously this crop is just starting to move. The previous 2020 crop, we don't foresee as many issues in the U.S. Mainly that's because all of the shipping lines equipment is sitting mainly in the U.S., between Asia and the U.S. and into Europe as well. With the massively increased cost of moving product out of Asia into the U.S. particularly, that has created other issues with regard to certain smaller, say, manufacturers and people not willing to pay the rates that are being commanded for or demanded for product coming out of Asia. And if we look at what we're getting ready to go into and coming out of this year, but particularly for next year, is a very competitive sourcing landscape for tobacco, particularly in South America. If we look at here in the U.S., the 2022 crop requirements for China will only come out early next year. And obviously that is key to any type of growth in tobacco production in the U.S. Next slide, please. Won't spend much time here, but just wanted to kind of give you a snapshot of where we see cigarette production going over the next several years. And you can see on the top line, excuse me, all of this is in billions of sticks, but you'll see the global cigarette production, and you can see there in 2021, we're sitting at about the 5.1 trillion stick level. If you look at the orange, that represents cigarette production in China, and in the white is the rest of the world. And one thing to particularly note that based on our forecasts and projections, by 2024, China will outproduce the rest of the world with regard to cigarette production. So that's just points out the importance of China to production of tobacco in North Carolina as well as the rest of the world. We are projecting about a 1.6 annual percentage decline in cigarette production going forward. Next slide, please. If we look at the actual demand and supply, this is a bit of a busy slide, but I'll point out what we're looking at. And all of this is in metric tons of production around the world. If you look at the top, in the blue is leaf production, and in the red line is what is required by the cigarette manufacturers. If you look at the bottom, obviously the green line is just the difference between the supply demand, what we call supply and demand balance, but the difference between the tobacco that's required for cigarette production and what's actually available, and that is new crop production plus inventory held by the manufacturers and the suppliers. If we look at where we are now, we do see that we are in an undersupply situation. A lot of that has been driven by the misread of cigarette consumption through the COVID pandemic, as well as reduction in manufacturers' duration levels, compounded by supply chain issues. So we're looking at, for the next year or two, still being in a bit of an undersupply situation, and we'll have to watch how the markets react to this particular phenomenon. And as you can see throughout the graphs, is tobacco excuse me, tobacco production is cyclical, and we're continually going in and out of undersupply or oversupply situation. Next slide, please. So if we look at actual U.S. trade policy as we see it from the tobacco side, and comparing the current administration with the previous administration, so far it's relatively similar. The Biden administration has continued to keep most of the trade policies in place, particularly the higher profile trade policies that were put in place by the Trump administration. One thing that we continue to watch closely, and as everyone watches the news every day understands, but obviously the U.S.-China trade relationship needs to, we need to keep a close eye on that. That in particular is very important for the North Carolina growers and what we see from an export standpoint to China. As we look at kind of what's different, obviously during the Trump administration, he had no issues with any type of trade issues with our allies or our partners. He was looking, basically, it seemed as that administration was looking as what was best for the U.S. trade relations or U.S. trade itself, looking at inadequate policies and trade barriers. The Biden administration, with regard to basically some of our bigger partners around the globe, it looks as if he's trying to mend some of those trade relations, particularly in the EU, specific to tobacco, is the steel and aluminum tariffs, where they put on retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products, particularly U.S. tobacco, with a 25% tariff. That is ended, which is we should see some improvement in the U.S. tobacco business because of that. Anyway, Ray, that was kind of a quick synopsis of where we see things standing going forward with regard to tobacco and specifically in North Carolina, but look forward to any questions and continuing discussions.
Thank you, Herbert. And I'm going to invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras back on and join me now for some Q&A. Let me re-invite folks that are participating to send questions through the Q&A box. I think Natasha gave away earlier that I may have my own if we don't hear from the folks on the other end, but I will certainly prioritize those over mine. Let's start with that. I mean, I came to Washington in an era when all the talk was about TPP, Dalton, and all these great things that were going to happen as a result of TPP. And then, you know, that ended up sort of flaming out. Now we're coming back with a more comprehensive and progressive TPP, a little bit different set of players maybe, but really two questions coming out of that. And one I have to give a hat tip to Christine about. But I guess the first one would be with regard to U.S. posture in terms of negotiating trade deals. Do you think we are in for an era of more bilateral agreement, or maybe at the most trilateral? Does it serve the U.S. interest to be in these big multi-country conversations that sometimes, frankly, collapse under their own weight? What is your take on, first of all, feel free to disagree with me about any of that, but long term, and then work in the UK comment again. I mean, I think there were a lot of folks that when TPP was clearly off the table, there was a thought that we could quickly jump in with the UK and do something there and negotiate an agreement. That ended up, of course, sort of losing steam. Put all those things together and help us make sense out of them. What do you think is going to happen in terms of this 11 country agreement type talk versus just good, strong bilateral work across the board? I'm going to let you lead, Dalton, and then we'll let others jump in.
For sure. Well, I think that is probably a couple of $1 trillion set of questions, Ray, in terms of where do we go from here? And I think two thoughts, maybe to kick things off. And the first is it has been a long time since the U.S. has really successfully done even a bilateral free trade agreement and brought it all the way through to conclusion. So USMCA, huge lift, especially under the Trump administration. Keeping that from being a withdrawal, but really at the end of the day, that was an update among well-known players, not necessarily going out and saying, look, you've got a completely different regulatory regime than we have, and we need to mesh these two things together. So I think I've even got a little bit of skepticism that there's a lot of appetite for true high standard bilateral free trade agreements, at least for a couple of years here. On CPTPP, it got so much tougher to say after the Canadians got a hold of it. I think how they handle China's application to join the pact is going to really set the tone for whether or not that's something that the U.S. can benefit from getting into. So I think, not to fully disagree with you, I think there is some value in those bigger multilateral ones because it lets us pick up countries that otherwise are going to be politically very challenging to sign an agreement with. So I think Vietnam probably rises to the top of my list on that one, right? Where going out and trying to sell a just simply U.S.-Vietnam free trade agreement to the U.S. Congress is going to be challenging. It's a communist country. It's got a little bit of a history of some labor challenges occasionally, and you just get a couple of commodities that benefit rather than you put a bunch of those smaller ones together and really end up with a big platform. But if CPTPP approves China joining without substantial reforms to their economy, then it's going to show that big multilateral approach just isn't going to work, and it's not something that will be considered by the U.S. Congress.
Stay on the China piece a little bit, because that was actually Christine's question, and then I'd like to move away from the CPTPP talk and continue to talk about China with our other panelists. But do you think that's realistic? I mean, do you think China actually gets to that table and is allowed to play ball, or is it just psychological warfare that they're posing at the moment?
I can't imagine that they get across the finish line in the current scenario, but they do already have the support of two countries within that bloc, which I think sends a pretty strong negative message initially and should be something that's relatively concerning.
Well, stay on China for a moment. Herbert, obviously a market that at one time was a growth market for U.S. leaf. Your take on really just in layman's terms, what do you see happening vis-a-vis the tobacco trade in China over the course of the next 5 to 10 years? And come off mute.
Sorry again. Ray, we do see the potential for growth from U.S. exports into China. As China's moving away from tobacco production into more food production, and they've kind of maxed out some of the other areas that they purchase, because they have mainly three main tobacco sourcing areas. That's Zimbabwe, Brazil, and the U.S. And they do buy a little bit smaller volumes from other areas, but they are the main three. And Zimbabwe is pretty much saturated now for the styles that China look for. Brazil is moving in that direction, even though there's massive production in Brazil, and U.S. is kind of where we see some more growth coming. Obviously, that depends a lot on the political environment and where things move with regard to trade. But we are excited that we think we can see some growth out of China.
Stay on the China topic, Christine. You talked a lot about Mexico. We know that's one of our biggest protein export markets, but just go a minute or two on China. What do you think? What do you think the future holds there, particularly in the short term, next 3 to 5 years?
Well, short term for me is like the next 3 to 5 months, but we're seeing, and I think it's important to talk about that, because what we're seeing right now is a lot of pushback. They've started to turn shipments away into China finding problems with our protein exports, which is a telltale sign that they're probably not going to be taking a lot more in the short run. Now, they had a collapse in their protein markets. They essentially had too much pork on their markets, and prices just took a nosedive here through the summer, late summer and the fall. Now that started to stabilize, and I think that they're really trying to probably keep some of that other protein out to bring up prices so that their local producers are profitable. not a bad move. In the next 3 to 5 years, I think it'd be a little bit, I don't know. In my view, China has blatantly told us that they want to be self-sufficient. So as much as possible, they're going to want to have that local source of protein and not import a lot of product. Now, I think for products like paws, where it's low cost, pretty much they're the only guy in town, it's cheap. I think we're going to maybe have an ongoing market there. Do I think we're going to expand into other parts? No, I really don't. I think it's going to remain fairly limited. Pork is a big unknown because we've got this disease factor. So, I think that, we've seen them have ongoing issues this year. We'll have a little bit of an uptick and then it'll kind of level out. I think we'd be much better off focusing our time and attention on developing a lot of these other markets. Dalton talked about Africa. There's obviously a lot of markets there that need our product. On the chicken side, I think that there's some opportunities in South and Central America that are exciting. We've been doing a good job getting into Colombia. I do think that there are some other opportunities for U.S. protein outside China. And that's probably where we should focus, given what they've told us, which is they don't want to buy our stuff.
It's fascinating. That sounds almost verbatim what I heard Greg Dowd say just a few weeks ago, that China seems to be the flashy object, but there's plenty of opportunities for U.S. protein in other markets, and that we've got to continue to focus on the ball there. So great input. Herbert, just to give you some idea of the acumen of the folks that are paying attention to the webinar this morning, there's a great question here I want to pose to you. Based on the data that you presented that showed a pretty even supply demand, you also talked about diminished reserves. I don't think that's the word you used, but basically diminished stocks, if you will, of U.S. leaf here. Translate that for us per the question asked here by the attendee. What does that mean on the farming side? What do you think domestic companies are going to do with regard to contracting? We're in an interesting time. December and January is always when we find out what the new H2a labor rate is going to be. So we got that great news yesterday, which I think was like another 31 cents an hour or something along those lines. So there's an increased cost there. There's obviously increased costs for fertilizer and pesticides and other inputs. What do you think is going to happen on the contracting side without getting yourself in any trouble here? What can you tell us today with regard to how the tobacco companies are going to manage that equilibrium and maybe that lower stock situation that you're in?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, we will find out indications or requirements from China in early next year. So that's a big component. From the export side, if you look at China being about the only one that's growing or has the potential to grow, there is some short-term possibilities to offset some of these lower duration levels that I mentioned and undersupply that we see in other parts of the world. But the U.S., from the domestic standpoint, the domestic manufacturers, obviously, they're seeing declines each year. So as we go forward, we obviously see that the U.S. domestics will need less and less tobacco. Not massively, but it'll continue to decline. So we need to offset the production by exports. And as I say, China is a big key to that. I see over the short term, at least, stable to potentially a small increase in production going forward in the short term. Obviously, we're facing that same and understand the question, and understand costs are going up. We're facing that all over the globe.
Sure.
And it's not just in tobacco, it's obviously other products as well with inflation. So we just have to see how the end users react to cost increases. That's, we're kind of stuck in the middle, and we're having to pass on cost increases to the manufacturers. So we have to see what their reaction is. But I think everyone's expecting some cost increases for sure.
Sure.
And
Sure. Well, let me switch. Great answer, great navigation of that, Herbert. We will wait to see. It's kind of a lawyer answer. It depends,
Yeah.
right? We'll see what we know. Or what is it the former president used to say? We'll know more about that later.
Right.
Dalton, one thing that we've sort of waited to know more about later in the wheat trade consistently now for a couple of decades is just the lack of GM adoption, particularly in wheat. Wheat is grown in North Carolina. I would say it's a significant crop, not acreage-wise as significant as corn and soybeans. But you all have always been in this interesting place where you're not deploying the GM technology, even though you have it. It's kind of sitting on the shelf, even here in the United States. Do you see that changing anytime soon? And if so, why or how or when?
I think it's a good question, and we're maybe as close to it as we've been in the last decade or so. So when we think back to like 2008, we had that dramatic run up, right? Wheat contracts at all-time price highs, and the world was kind of running out of wheat. And they said, my gosh, we have got to get technology into wheat production. And that led to a big push. So the industry in the US is still supportive, provided that we can get overseas customer acceptance. And that's been particularly tough, especially in many of our largest Asian markets. Now, the thing that's maybe changing right now, and I think there are two factors at play. One is with gene editing technology coming down the pipe. I think the industry is going to have to sit back and say, how much do we need to kick the GM hornet's nest, or can we make similar gains just with gene editing, which seems to be more widely accepted by consumers? So you've got that dynamic in play, but you also have the first commercialization of a GM wheat product in Argentina. So it is a drought and herbicide tolerant wheat, and their largest customer, Brazil, just approved imports of the GM flour. They didn't go all the way to approving imports of GM wheat. So that it'll be interesting to see how the Brazilian flour millers handle that. But this could be the first time that we see consumers eating a GM wheat product, and it's got a great sustainability and carbon story that goes along with it because of that drought tolerance. So kind of in a little bit of a wait and see mode for a couple of years here. While we see how consumers handle that one.
It sounds like a chink in the armor, right? If you're taking the flour, but you're not taking the wheat, the whole wheat itself. We've got the opposite, or something actually a little bit similar in Mexico now with this idea that we will allow GM into the feed stock, but not into the human stock. Any comments on that, and whether that's a blip or a blueprint for what we might deal with Mexico for years to come?
You know, I'm probably a little bit in the minority of folks when we watch Mexico and we say, is this a blip, or does it represent a fundamental shift that they're going to become more like the Europeans in using the precautionary principle, which is just, an overabundance of caution on everything. And maybe it's just my optimistic thinking that, Mexico is our single largest market, that I really like to think that this is a blip, that they will come back around, that reasoned dialogue will succeed. We've been able to stay out of a lot of that fray. Just simply, it certainly is a much bigger thing on a corn front when you think about GM traits that are actively being grown in the U.S. and the size of that market. But I think in terms of the success of U.S. agricultural exports, it's tough to see Mexico continuing to hold the spot that they do for us if we can't get back to a regulatory regime that's predictable and based in sound science.
Wow, Dalton, well said. And Christine, I think the EU market and their reticence for some of our GMO technology and frankly just some of their domestic policy that they're adopting and pushing. What does that mean for protein? Does it mean anything when you see Mexico sort of bow up against GM? We've got a long history in the EU of that. What does that mean for for North Carolina? 66% of North Carolina's ag economy, which is pork and poultry. What does that mean for us here?
I think Europe just becomes increasingly less competitive, which is kind of good news. I think the way I think about it, they blatantly said in their policy statements that they really aren't focused on export markets. across the board, which is actually creates less competition for the U.S. Good deal. Mexico, though, I find it really interesting because, you know, they don't have a lot of policy tools that they can kind of pull out of that toolbox. I find it, you know, the president there is in a really tough spot trying to kind of bring up the bottom, you know, the poorest of the poor in parts of Mexico. And I think that he's trying to balance kind of how do you keep the economy going while at the same time trying to stimulate that bottom percentage of the rural economy and their general kind of population. And so I think it's a little bit of, you know, pounding the chest, but ultimately Mexico still relies heavily on imported feed grains, especially, and relative to another one of the questions here, you know, you look at how U.S. product prices into Mexico. We're competitive in that market because we're selling the lowest value product. You know, the dark meat, which I personally love, you know, and a lot of the bone-in product that we just can't get through the market here. So, you know, I think on a relative basis, we're still going to be super competitive because we offset the value of that lowest value product with sales of high value product here in the US, like breast meat or, you know, bacon. You know, we're selling some of that into Mexico, but for the most part, you know, we're able to kind of get that whole value carcass up because of the ability to offset that high value product with lower value sales into Mexico. Kind of a roundabout way of saying, you know, EU policies are just insane to me.
Well, and it's interesting. One of our other questioners raised a point. We're actually seeing, and his name is Paul Ulock over at the Biotech Center, which we work closely with. It looks like we're actually seeing some of the technology that would have been developed and deployed over in the EU. We're actually seeing some of that come to the States, and in particular coming to the Research Triangle to be developed and deployed out of here. Of course, our concern is that the products and the crops that we end up implementing that technology into, that we'll have difficulty selling it back across the pond. Just a quick take on that. I mean, do you see that? And what's Europe going to do? I mean, they're going to have to get food from somewhere. What is their answer to this? It's perplexing. It's been perplexing now for a decade, but it seems like they're really serious about this path they're on.
Yeah, and I think when push comes to shove, they might find, you know, with the cost of their products going up, that they might not continue down that path, but it'll take a long time for them to get to that. But, you know, look at Prop 12. You know, you look at the impact of that policy on our ability to sell pork into California and what that's going to do to their cost short run until they can adjust. And it's not too dissimilar from what we're seeing on a very amplified basis in Europe. So Europe says we want to reduce, you know, cropland overall, I think 25%, and we want to put everything into organic. And, you know, the reality is that there's a cost to that, to the consumer. And I think that if we don't look at our own policies and make sure that they're sound, we're going to have a very similar situation. And a lot of those policies being driven by a very small minority. And you're seeing that a lot in Europe, to be honest, because consumers generally tell us that they want low cost food. And I think that from a food security standpoint, if you think through kind of that UN kind of policy environment, the reality is we need low cost food that's safe for the environment. And I think we can balance that without getting rid of all of this hard work that we've developed as an agricultural community. I just find the EU policy perplexing. Yeah. Well, I work for European banks, so don't tell.
Fair enough. No, you got to speak the language sometimes. I can't help but see the time and that we're past an hour, so we're going to cut it off. It's clear there are more questions we could get to. I happen to be able to see on Christine's screen I think that's a treadmill over there in the corner. And I think maybe that is a little bit apropos for our discussion. When you're working on international trade issues, the treadmill keeps running whether you're on it or not. And the questions could keep coming here. This has been a great discussion, great insight for our folks here in North Carolina. Appreciate the relationship that we have with each of you. In particular, I'll mention Rabo is a chamber member, and certainly Alliance One and Pixis. We're grateful to have those relationships and appreciate your support. Dalton, we work closely with our wheat growers here in the state of North Carolina, and appreciate you being with us this afternoon or this morning. Good luck with your time in South Dakota. Get back home and love on Samuel as quick as you can. And I hope those late nights wind down here in a few months and you're able to sleep all the way through. Appreciate you all. Again, just closing announcements. We hope the content was valuable to you. I know I learned a lot. It's always fun to talk about these issues. There will be a brief survey that pops up on your screen as you exit. Please feel free to fill that out and give us some feedback. That helps us improve the sessions. We will be sending a recording of the webinar and make sure you know how to get up with each of these speakers individually. Again, thanks for being with us. Have a great holiday season. And we look forward to seeing you first quarter next year when we are probably going to talk about carbon markets and what it is that North Carolina growers need to know. What does the North Carolina ag community need to know about emerging and developing carbon markets inside the United States? Y'all have a great evening, great rest of the day, and stay in touch with us here at the Chamber. Take care.